And joining us now from Tasmania, Australia, is Richard Flanagan, an Australian novelist considered by many to be the finest Australian novelist of his generation. According to The Economist, each of his novels have attracted major praise and received numerous awards and honours, including the 2014 Man Booker Prize. His latest novel is First Person, and he has an op-ed at the New York Times, Australia is committing climate suicide. Welcome to Background Briefing, Richard Flanagan.
Thank you, Anne.
Well, it's a pleasure, Richard, and your piece in the New York Times recently really got my attention. And is it the case, as some people have written into the New York Times picking up on your suggestion, that Australia is the Chernobyl of climate crisis?
Well, that was the analogy I drew in the article, and I drew it for several reasons. One is because this is the first time I think that we've had a catastrophe which can be directly linked to climate change affecting the majority of a developed nation, or the majority of the population of a developed nation. And in consequence, and it's a rolling crisis, it's not a single event, it's events that began some months ago and it's going to continue for several months more. And I think it's leading people all across Australia to fundamentally question the direction the country's taken. There is a great and growing anger with the leadership of the country, which seems to, in the eyes of many, have betrayed the people, both in its response to actually dealing with the fires and its preparation for the fires, and also more fundamentally in the way it's been working for nearly a quarter of a century now to subvert and deny any attempt at climate change mitigation, both internationally and within Australia. Australia does feel, and this may sound far-stretched, but I was recently in Eastern Europe, and I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe from the 1980s on, and it feels very reminiscent to me of Eastern Europe in the 1980s. You have these Brezhnevian leaders who look like they've been there forever. They're old. They're completely out of touch with reality. They're imprisoned in the sclerotic madnesses of their ideology, and they're supported by a monstrous propaganda machine, in the case of the political establishment in Australia, by the Murdoch press, which has virtually a monopoly in all major cities. And at the same time, you seem to have a very compliant population, and change seems impossible. But it's like some vast glacier where nothing moves, and then finally it carves some huge iceberg. In fact, La Havel used this extraordinary image after the Velvet Revolution, where he described dissidents. He described going to a bridge where there was a frozen river, and each night he'd go to the bridge and he'd see another candle being lit beneath the ice. And he'd go back the next night and there'd be another candle and another, but still the river was frozen over. And then one night he went there and the river was flowing free again. And I think that's what's beginning to happen in Australia. You're seeing more and more people speaking out, whether it's a firefighter pulling up and jumping out and telling the media in very direct language what he thinks of the Prime Minister, whether it's a pregnant woman who refuses to shake the Prime Minister's hand, whether it's one of the most senior firefighting figures in Australia who has basically called bullshit on the Prime Minister. It goes on and on and on. People are standing up and there is a change in the mood, and people recognise that the fires like Chernobyl in the end are a symbol for something much more fundamentally wrong with their system. And change is possible. Change will happen. I think that's undoubted. Change will happen. The question is whether it's change for the better or change for the worse, but something transformational is happening in this summer of fire in Australia, and it's something I've only ever experienced before in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. It's a situation I've not seen in my life in Australia before, where you suddenly feel that the government and the people have fundamentally diverged. And I'm not sure what happens when the fire ends, but Australia is transformed forever after this event. I think that there can be little doubt of that.
Well, clearly there's an appalling leadership void. Not that that's not a kind of tradition. I mean, going back, there was a book written many years back called The Lucky Country that sort of suggested that Australia's always had mediocre political leadership, with a couple of rare exceptions. But the one that Australia has now is particularly out of touch. He was recently booed, as your article mentioned, in the town of Cobargo, that was actually my mother's hometown. That's where she grew up. That was largely burned to the ground, and he was booed by the residents. But he does seem to be a kind of composite of Trump's denial, Pence's piety, and Bolsonaro's contempt for the environment. How would you describe him?
Well, I think he's sort of the Neville Chamberlain of climate change. He's a man who went into our parliament waving around a lump of coal, telling Australians not to be scared. I think Australians are terrified now. He pursued a policy not simply of appeasement, but of collaboration with the coal and gas industries. And Australia is now the largest exporter in the world of coal and of gas. And although Australia's emissions 1.3% of the world's, by 2030, we will be a producer, if you include our exports, a producer of, will be the sixth largest producer in the world of carbon emissions, if we include exports. That there's a very close relationship between the fossil fuel industries and the Conservative parties, and Morrison's been a leading cheerleader for those companies. Morrison won a close election here, in no small part because of the support given him by a coal oligarch called Clive Palmer, who formed a puppet party, the United Australia Party, on which he then spent over double the combined advertising budgets of the two major parties, the Labor and Liberal parties, in order to keep Labor out of power. Labor had a limited but real climate change agenda, or climate action agenda. And Palmer has plans to build a huge coal mine in the Galilee Basin, the plans for which he submitted shortly after the election. And this government owes Palmer its power. They're heavily indebted to him, and they're going to try and deliver everything he wants and that the other fossil fuel companies want. What should be happening in Australia is there should be an end to the extraordinary subsidies to the fossil fuel industries, which amount to about $1,200 US per person. There should be a moratorium on any new coal or gas developments, and we should clean up our own act locally. We're currently, if we're the leading exporter in the world of coal and gas, we're also ranked 57th out of 57 countries on climate change action. And we need to improve vastly and rapidly. And then if our country is to have any chance in the future, and I think this is the realisation that's sinking in Australia, that our very viability as a nation is now under threat because of climate change. And if the scientists' predictions are right, and the scientists predicted everything that's happening here many years ago, and if the scientists are right about the future, and there's every reason to think they would be, given they've been so right in the past, their predictions are that if we continue on the present trajectory, which globally is for 3 Celsius or above increase in temperatures, most of mainland Australia will be uninhabitable within 80 years. And so if we're to have a future, we need to clean up our own act and then go out and fight as hard as we can to be a global leader, persuading the rest of the planet to join with us, because what you're seeing in Australia is simply a wake-up call to the rest of the world. What you're seeing in Australia is the future.
And you mentioned the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, showing up in Parliament with a chunk of coal and accusing the opposition party of coalophobia. As recently as November, his Deputy Prime Minister, who, as you point out in your article, blamed these fires on exploding horse manure, he's calling climate activists inner city raving lunatics. What is going on, though, with legislation that is kind of Orwellian and scary, the sense that they want to literally criminalise peaceful protests by environmentalists?
There's a whole range of legislation being proposed in various stages of enactment, which seek to criminalise democracy. And what's interesting with Morrison, who really made his name as the immigration minister who perfected the system of cruelty against refugees, which is known in Australia as the Pacific solution, whereby refugees were interned in hellish Pacific islands, is that the same combination of a complete indifference to human suffering, a contempt for democratic processes, a culture of secrecy. All these same tactics are now being applied to try and crush questioning, discussion, and democratic opposition to the crisis that's affecting Australia. And I think really what you see in Australia is a growing war between the voice of coal and gas versus the voice of the people. And I cannot convey to you enough the enormous sense of sadness and grief that is affecting so many people here, because what we're seeing is an extraordinarily beautiful world. Australia has the most beautiful natural world, and Australians have a very strong connection with it. And it's vanishing all around us this summer, and much of it will never be the same again. It will never come back. There's just an enormous sadness for everybody in this. To get to your point, when that starts expressing itself politically, this grief, this anger, this rage, that the government is going to use all the forces of the state to try and deny it, to suppress it, and to imprison those who seek to voice it. In my own home state of Tasmania, there's now legislation pending that will see environmental protesters go to jail for up to 21 years. I mean, this is the stuff of tyrannies. It's impossible to believe it's happening in my own country, and yet it is.
But surely there will be a backlash of people power. If you say that the country is in a state of grief, and frankly a lot of the world is in a state of grief. You know, the koala is an iconic animal. 1 billion koalas and kangaroos and other animals have apparently been burned alive in all of these fires, which, as you point out, will go on for at least a month. Everybody's feeling the pain, and surely there will be a political response. I mean, as draconian as these laws are, can they pass them in an environment where the majority...
As we said, as we were talking about at the beginning, it does feel like a Chernobyl moment, and it was Gorbachev who wrote many years later that the collapse of the Soviet Union began with the Chernobyl crisis. And I think things are going to change rapidly. They may go subterranean for a while, but I don't think people will feel they have a choice, because they're not being offered the necessary change they know they need if we are to continue in a viable form into the future. I mean, this feels to many Australians like a fundamental crisis. You know, it feels like a war, except it's not entirely clear who the enemy is. Just to clarify a point about the number of animals dead, scientists estimated about 2 weeks ago, I think, that it was 500 million animals, but they now think that estimate is a severe underestimate. They also think many species, both plant, animal, and even some birds, may well be extinct in consequence. So there's a massive ecocide happening at the same time. And there's also the huge economic impact it's going to have on the country. And people are going to feel it very directly, because vast areas of Australia are going to become uninsurable. And this is going to have consequences that ripple through commerce, industry, and finance.
But if you can't breathe the air in Sydney, isn't that being immediately felt? I mean, what do people do when the air is 10 times above the safe limit?
I think in the short, I mean, people seek to evade it, but they stay inside, they wear masks, and they get angry. You know, they also, you know, there's a high level of growing stress and worry associated with this. And in the end, that starts manifesting itself as anger. And ultimately, I think it'll lead to the sort of things we're already seeing, which is these public shows of contempt for political leaders. And I've never seen that in Australia before.
And does that extend, though, to the Labor Party? Because your article mentions that Labor has been friendly to the coal lobby and the coal barons, and there were, I don't know whether it's about jobs, it's the same thing here in this country. And of course, Trump is like Morrison. He didn't hold up a piece of coal, but he keeps talking about wonderful, clean coal, which is an absurd lie and an oxymoron. So would this mean that the only people left in Australian politics would be the Greens that have any respect?
Well, I think the Labor Party is still a major party. Its record on these issues is mixed. Unlike the Conservative Party here, it's not captive to the climate denialists. The people in the Labor Party accept the science of climate change, and they went to the last election with a reasonable, if limited, policy on climate change action. Where they fall down is that they continue to take money from the fossil fuel industries, and they continue to support their development. And I think the debate will be shifting very quickly after these fires finally end to recognising the need to having to wind those industries down. Of course, that's a complex transition, and it can't happen overnight, and it has to happen with justice and with a lot of forethought and a lot of investment into the communities affected, so that people continue to have work and better work. But it has to happen because the alternative is the devastation we're seeing all around us today.
And surely the Conservatives will suffer politically, because this isn't a big part of their constituency, the country party, the rural folk. They're the ones that have been most impacted. Farms and farmers have died. And
well, it's very hard to know how it expresses itself politically, certainly in terms of election, but you would have to think this is a fundamental crisis for those parties which have so supported climate denialism for so long. I mean, you had a leading government member on BBC 2 days ago denying any connection between climate change and these bushfires, whereas the senior firefighting chiefs, the people on the ground who've fought fires for decades, are saying we've never seen fires like this in their ferocity, in their intensity, in their scale. And they're the ones calling for action on climate change, not environmentalists, not inner city types. The actual people out there on the front line fighting the fires are saying this is about climate change and there has to be action on climate change.
And Australia surely can't get it both ways, in the sense that they may not be the great emitters. And even Morrison himself quoted the Kyoto Protocol, saying that Australia was doing well within the bounds of that, which of course is largely irrelevant now. But still, if you send all your coal to China and it gets burned, it's in the atmosphere, which is causing global warming. So.
Well, it's complete hypocrisy. As I said, by 2030, if all the planned projects are realised, as they will be unless there's change, we will be the 6th largest producer of carbon emissions.
Right. So is that sinking in? Is the guilt or the responsibility sinking in to make the connection between the apocalypse that they're seeing in the air they can't breathe and the glowing horizon encroaching on them? Can they make that connection, do you think? Will they make that connection?
I think people are making that connection. You've got people, up and down the eastern seaboard of Australia living in third world shanty towns without power, without drinkable water, without communications. This situation is going to go on for months. There are going to be other communities that get burned out. There are going to be more deaths, more tragedies. It's going to go on and on. So it will change. But I think I think you're seeing two things happening in Australia. This huge change in the mentality of the people recognising that climate change is a factor, that Australia is a guilty party in causing climate change. At the same time, you have the voices of coal beginning to fight back, and aided and abetted in Australia by the power of the Murdoch press, which owns about 58% of all their newspapers and uses them in a sort of enforcer fashion. So anyone that speaks out on climate action, on these connections between Australia drying out. I mean, the fires are only one aspect. We've got huge problems with agriculture because of the nation's drying out. We've got towns all over Australia either having run out of water or soon to run out of water, with no likelihood for a long time of them having water. But this is a crisis of which the bushfires are the pointy end. But it's only one aspect of the crisis. But in all that, the Murdoch press are deeply complicit in their promotion of a climate denialist agenda, and that they are as guilty as anybody. I mean, in one sense, Australia is a vast crime scene, and there are guilty parties, and the Murdoch press is one of them. They should be, they should be so ashamed of their role in this. It's been appalling, and really they need to change, their stance on this issue, because it's not really about politics at all. It shouldn't be about that. This is about our survival as a people. It's a fundamental issue.
Well, maybe some of our listeners here in Los Angeles can protest in front of Rupert Murdoch's vineyard right here in Bel Air, which actually recently a fire came all the way up to the vineyard and almost burned it down. So he's almost been scorched by the reality of climate change. But for the American audience, just in closing, Richard Flanagan, what you're telling us, the domination of the Murdoch press, and of course they do have influence over television as much as they do over printed newspapers, the idea would be that in this country, about 60% of the media in this country was just like Fox News. That would get people's attention to understand how much Australians are propagandized.
They're propagandised on the one hand, and they've just been fed lie after lie after lie about climate change. And on the other hand, anybody, any scientist, any public figure, any journalist, anybody who seeks to simply speak the truth about what is happening has their character fundamentally attacked. Whether it's a fire chief, whether it's a senior scientist. The most terrible thing about these fires is that Australia's own scientists predicted that climate change would lead to these bushfires back in the mid-1980s. There's a wonderful national government organisation for scientific research called the CSIRO, and their scientists predicted all that has subsequently happened. From 1996, the Australian Conservative governments began working to subvert any action on climate change. These people, our leaders, betrayed our country, and they've been betraying it for over a quarter of a century, and now we're living in the ashy ruins of that betrayal. That great black betrayal.
Well, Richard Flanagan, I thank you very much for joining us from Australia.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Richard Flanagan, who's an Australian novelist from Tasmania, considered by many to be the finest Australian novelist of his generation. According to The Economist, each of his novels have attracted major praise and received numerous awards and honours, including the 2014 Man Booker Prize, and his latest novel is First Person, and he has an op-ed at the New York Times, Australia is committing climate suicide.